My name is Andrew Westover. I'm the Eleanor McDonald Storrs, the Director of Education here at the High Museum of Art. Thank you for joining us this evening. First, I'd like to thank the High Museum members who are here in attendance. Your support is invaluable and fuels our mission. And if you are not yet a member of the museum or need to renew, please visit high.org at the end of the program to do so. I'd also like to thank High Museum staff members Erin Dowdy, John Borges, and the full High team for their essential support for making this program happen. You know, tonight's program is particularly special because it's an example of the knowledge-building work that institution seeks to do. Through critical conversations like this one, we seek to build new understandings, both of art and the context art and artists engage. So thank you again for joining this discussion. You may notice some yellow letters at the bottom of the screen. This is cart captioning. There is a wonderful person sitting in another room who in real time is typing out what they're hearing. So please feel free to, of course, appreciate them, but also give them grace in case it's a word they aren't familiar with. Now, I'll turn the conversation over and the introductions of the remainder to Dr. Katherine Jentleson, Marian Van Boom, curator of folk and self-taught art, who will frame this evening's conversation and introduce honored guests. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Andrew, for that wonderful introduction. And my panelists are going to join me on stage before I introduce them in a moment. So tonight's program, as Andrew was saying, is really special. It's part of a grant that we got, a very generous one from the Terra Foundation for American Art, which supports permanent collection projects that offer more diverse, equitable, accessible, and inclusive histories of American art. And this panel is really just the beginning of something larger. It serves as a keynote for a series of conversations that we have planned for tomorrow with an incredibly esteemed group of quilters, curators, and quilt scholars that include my friends and colleagues here on stage tonight, but is actually a much larger group. So if you're in that group, would you stand and be recognized, if you don't mind? We'd all like to welcome you to Atlanta, if you came. We so appreciate that all of you have made the journey, whether it was from across the country or from just across I-20 or another one of our major thoroughfares. We're very happy to have everybody here tonight. So this is also kind of part of something that's been building at the High for a while that I just wanted to frame before we begin our discussion. The High has always had incredible works by Black women quilters in its collection, or not always, but since the 1980s. We, at that time acquired an iconic Freedom Quilt by Jessie Telfair, and continued to build that collection through the 90s and into the early 2000s with work by G's Ben masters like Annie Mae Young. But it's really only in recent years that we've made a significant commitment to representing Black quilts at the High Museum. We've more than quadrupled the representation of Black quilts within our collection since 2017. And this was really an initiative that I felt very strongly about because I wanted to make sure that we were presenting at all times quilts in our permanent collection galleries. And this is what, these are all different installation shots from over the years. An incredible quilt that's on view right now by Carolyn White, who's in the audience here, an Atlanta-based quilter. And it just gives you a sense that, to me, quilts are works of art that should be incorporated into displays of all different kinds of media and all different kinds of stories within our collection galleries. And if you want to display quilts, you have to have a lot of them because they're light sensitive, so you can't keep them hanging for long periods of time. And so this really meant that we had to really start making a much larger commitment to representing Black quilters in the collection. And that was happening, and so was something else, as many of you may have seen at the High last year. We had Amy Sherrill's incredible portrait of First Lady Michelle Obama. And one thing that's so special about That painting, but also Carolyn White's quilt about a little girl, Parker Curry, looking up to Michelle Obama during that incredible moment in 2018, is that it's all about the kind of the ways that quilters have really been responsible for creating abstraction, for creating their own abstract languages, their own artistic languages throughout history, and they really haven't always been recognized for doing so. But when Amy Sherald chose that dress for Michelle Obama, she did so in part because it represented not only abstraction by, white male canonical masters like Piet Mondrian, but also the abstraction of Gee's Bend quilters like Loretta Petway. And Carolyn White was very much paying homage to the Gee's Bend quilters as well in her quilt. And it's not just that quilters are often creating these incredible abstract works of art, it's that they have inspired so many of the modern masters of the 20th century and 21st centuries. And this is something that I'm really interested in looking more deeply to with future exhibitions and publications at the High. But everyone from Nellie Mae Rowe to Romery Bearden were inspired by the quilters in their lives, even though they didn't necessarily choose quilting as their medium, but they took the lessons that they learned from quilters and applied them to different kinds of art practice. So all that being said, that's kind of where we're coming from at the High Museum, is that we really want to think about increasing our representation of quilts, but also contextualizing them within all different sorts of histories. And we couldn't be more excited to be doing that really with incredible thought partners like the ones that we have here on stage and in the audience tonight. So tonight I'm joined by first my colleague Dr. Bridget R. Cooks, a scholar and curator who's focused on African American art and serves as a Chancellor's Fellow and Professor of African American Studies and Art History at the University of California, Irvine. She's curated several exhibitions, including Lava Thomas Homecoming of 2022, the Black Index, which was on view, and it toured between 2021 and 2022, Ernie Barnes, a retrospective, and Grafton Tyler Brown, Exploring California. Her writing can be found widely across interdisciplinary academic publications and art exhibition catalogs. She's most well known and certainly kind of came into my intellectual development with her incredible book, Exhibiting Blackness, African Americans and the American Art Museum, published by the University of Massachusetts Press in 2011. And for that book, she received some incredible honors, the James A. Porter and David C. Driscoll Book Award in African American Art History. So just contributing incredible things to many different fields. She's had many other awards from the Ford Foundation, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Getty Research Institute, California Humanities, and the Henry Luce Foundation. So we're thrilled that you're here with us tonight, Bridget. Seated next to her is O.V. Brantley. O.V. is nationally famous. Some of you are here just to see her tonight. I've already introduced yourselves. She's nationally famous as a quilter who began quilting in 1999 and since then has made more than 300 quilts. She is a founding member and past president of the Brown Sugar Stitchers Quilt Guild and is also a co-founder of the Atlanta Quilt Festival, the largest African American quilt festival in the country. Her quilts have won awards at various quilt shows and been featured in several publications, including Georgia Quilts, Piecing Together a History, and Say Your Piece, Black Women, Mothers, Martyrs, and Misunderstood, and Long Time Coming, a retrospective of O.V. Brantley's red and white quilts, which was just here in Atlanta earlier this year. Several of her quilts, including Shoes to Bloom, have been exhibited at the International Quilt Festival, which is a great honor. And in 2019, she was commissioned by the United Negro College Fund to create a memory quilt for Oprah Winfrey. Yes. Welcome, O.V. And then seated next to O.V., our final panelist, is Marcia McDowell. Marcia McDowell is a professor and curator of quilt studies and folk arts at Michigan State University Museum, and a museum, I should say, that has really been beating the drum for quilts and quilt histories for decades. She's also the director at Michigan Traditional Arts Program and director at the Quilt Index. As a publicly engaged scholar, her work is grounded in an interdisciplinary approach to material culture, informed primarily by art historical, folklorist, and ethnographic theories and methodologies. She focuses on documentation and analysis of the production, meaning, and use of traditional material culture, particularly quilt making, especially that of the Hmong American, African American, Native American, South African, and Southwest Chinese minority women. The role of museums in contemporary society and creation of innovative ways, including digital repositories, to increase access to and use of traditional arts materials. Her book, Quilts and Related Textiles of South Africa, Investigating an African Art, is forthcoming. So let's have one more round of applause for everyone who's here tonight on stage and beyond. Switch to the other mic. And kick off a kind of discussion and series of presentations. So as I said, I mean, Bridget's book, Exhibiting Blackness, is really a Bible, I think, for anybody who wants to understand the ways that many different kinds of Black art have been received in institutional contexts over the course of the 20th century, quilts within that, right? And so that's why I really kind of wanted to start off with this question, as a historian of Black art and its reception histories, can you share with us a little bit about how Black quilts have been seen and unseen and represented and misrepresented over time?
Yes. So thanks, Katie. Thanks for all of this. And thanks, everybody, for taking time to be here with us. So there's a lot to say to answer this question, but I wanted to start just by talking about some missed opportunities. We think about the most influential quilt show in mainstream art museums, big museums, right? Like the Met and the National Gallery and the Whitney and that kind of thing. So we think about the most influential exhibition being Abstract Design in American Quilt from 1971, which premiered at the Whitney, and the International Quilt Museum recently had a celebration commemorating that exhibition. And that exhibition was important in the sense that it brought quilts, which is considered low art and women's art, right, crossing over these various boundaries as craft to be in an art museum. The focus primarily was on quilts from Amish country, Amish quilters, and thinking about, mostly anonymously, the names have not been recorded, but associating those quilts with region and place. There were no southern states represented in that exhibition. So I think about that as a missed opportunity for making the work of Black quilters known. In David C. Driscoll's exhibition, 2 Centuries of Black American Art in 1976, there was a coverlet. And that, to my knowledge, is the first time that there was a feature of a quilt made by an anonymous African-American woman in a major show in the context of Black artists. We also have Black folk art in America, and Regina Perry talked about quilts, particularly through the work of Harriet Powers in her essay, but there are no quilts that were in that exhibition. So we can think about that as a kind of missed opportunity. And part of the tension is between craft and art, and there are people that feel very strongly, about maintaining these boundaries. I am not one of them. I think it's a silly distraction, but that we can be featured more focused on creativity and not these kind of hierarchies that the art world creates. Boston Museum of Fine Arts, one of the early collectors of Harriet Powers' work, one of her 2 Bible quilts. Faith Ringgold crossing all kinds of boundaries in the 1990s with the French collection. And then we think about, in 2002, the Quilts of Gee's Bend, which was organized by Bill and Matt Arnett as being the first major challenge to really show this, undisputable truth of Black creativity through textiles. So the last thing I want to say, just to give a bit of exhibition history there, but And then the Arnett's went on to have a series of shows. G's Ben, The Architecture of the Quilt, Mary Lee Bendolph, G's Ben Quilts and Beyond, both in 2006, and then, of course, the G's Ben Quilters. You know, they have their whole story, you know, everything changed after that, 2002. But I think, you know, the thing I did want to say in response to this prompt is also about interpretation and a missed opportunity. I think for many people, when quilts by Black women were presented by museums, they were accepted by some, and certainly not by all, because they looked like paintings. And I appreciate the appreciation of composition and color and line and shape and abstraction and all of that. But I think something is really missed when you don't pay attention to the form. When you think about the fact that these Black women were making quilts instead of paintings, if you really want to focus on that, we have to look at a history of racism and sexism in the United States, right? So that these women did not have the pedigree and the opportunities that people like Piet Mondrian or the great masters, American and European, had. And I think in order to acknowledge and really fully appreciate their work, you have to appreciate their story. And that is an American story that many people are not interested in really paying attention to. So you'd have to acknowledge and really hopefully understand why this creativity is in the form of quilts and not in painting. And I think it's easy to say that the work is so beautiful, it's like a painting, and that's supposed to be a kind of compliment, right? I don't think it is. But again, I think it's important to really think about that American history that would have to force someone to say Black women for generations have had the intellectual and creative capacity and will to make a way out of no way, to make something beautiful that they were never supposed to make, you know, to have that form to express. They didn't have the education, they didn't have the access to opportunities and, you know, in these formal circles that we appreciate now. So I do see that as a missed opportunity to really reckon with the reality of that history and the conditions under which the quilts were made.
Thank you, Bridget. Did you want to share a little bit about some of the artists that you're...
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Katie. Yes. So we were all asked to bring some images, and so thinking about G's Bend and looking at Andrea Williams, I mean, it's not going to get better than this. I mean, I think what we see with the quilts of G's Bend, that particular exhibition in 2002, is people were silenced by what they saw on the walls. And they couldn't believe it, so they said, this looks like it could be by, it's like, no. This was made by her. And can you sort of do the mental gymnastics you need to do and change your understanding about Blackness to be able to understand where that creativity comes from? So it's not going to get better than this. I mean, this is silencing. It's a story of multiple lives in quilts like this. And then I just have a couple of other, you know, when I say it's not going to get better than this, what I mean is we will see different. We will see other kinds of exciting, invigorating work like Bisa Butler. I also feel like it's not going to get better than that either. You know, and it's also not a competition. There's room for everybody to be the best. I mean, to put Bisa Butler in conversation with Andrea Williams, I mean, that's an explosive conversation and mutual admiration. What Bisa's doing with color and perspective, texture, the history of different patterns, it's just like, it's hard to talk about. It's just so incredibly dynamic and undeniable. Sanford Biggers, I know my time is up now. Sanford Biggers, right? And I mean, the way that he's reworking quilts, that he's creating these other dimensions and thinking about movement and temporality, calling on the ancestors, right? Right, when we think about that silhouette, right? I mean, this is a history that is so powerful, and it's layers upon layers. I think he's creating portals for the next great migration through this work. It's so inspiring and well-informed. I think, yes, just because I'm from LA, I had to shout out Ramesses. This is how he pronounces his name, Ramesses, in his work, Harriet Tubman, and he's constantly evoking in a figurative way the ancestors, and again, another very powerful way to pay homage to who we are and our history and the people that have helped us be here now.
Thank you, Bridget. Next, I wanted to invite O.V. Brantley to speak a little bit about a variety of things. I think
Yes.
we're gonna get back to your own quilts and your own quilting practice and the work that you've done with the Atlanta Quilt Festival. But first, I think we're gonna talk about the brown sugar stitchers. Yeah.
Yes. Good evening. I'm O.V. Brantley. I want to thank Katie for pulling this together. I am so excited. I am trying to contain myself. But I will tell you, I get to be the joyful part of the program. I have been asked to talk about 3 things and given 8 minutes to do so, which is very hard because I am a lawyer in real life, a retired lawyer. But I'm going to make it work or Andrew's going to get me. I've been asked to talk about the Brown Sugar Stitchers, the Atlanta Quilt Festival, and my personal quilts. And I want to start with the Brown Sugar Stitchers because that's sort of the beginning of my story, and it has been such an important part of my quilting life. I know that there are a lot of Brown Sugar Stitchers here in the audience. Would you please wave if you're a member of the Brown Sugar Stitchers? Thank you. They are all here to support me because that's what quilters do. But I do want to point out that our current president, Peggy Martin, is here, and she is sitting right over here. So the Brown Sugar Stitchers we're in our 23rd year. And when we began over 20 years ago, we were all pretty much new quilters, beginning quilters. And we have 2 founders, Nancy and Jocelyn, and they found a location at the Wesley Chapel Library for us to meet. And we just started meeting and spreading the word, and friends told friends, and we would meet once a month and talk quilts and try to figure out what we were doing. And finally, we gave ourselves a name, which was the Brown Sugar Stitchers, and we were officially on the map. The slide that you're looking at is, I included our book. We actually published a 20-year anniversary book, which I believe is on Amazon. The most important, that deserves a round of applause. But the most important part of the book, of course, is on page 117, and that would be my page. Most of the quilters in the Guild were allowed to have 2 pages in the book, and you're looking at my page, which shows Oprah getting the quilt that I made for her, and some other quilts that are special to me. And of course, the obligatory group photo. The best part about quilting is the gathering part. We do it because we like each other. We like spending time with each other. I mean, the only reason to make a quilt is because you love somebody when you're a beginner. I mean, because you could go to Walmart and buy a quilt. So we're all making quilts because we wanted people we love to have one of our quilts. And so every year we had a tea, and every holiday season in December we'd have some kind of luncheon. So all of the Brown Sugar Stitchers are just best friends and we love each other. So it's just a great, great thing. Now with Zoom, we've expanded to nationally, and Peggy tells me we have 140 members. So that's kind of the background of my quilting. Along the way, you can go to the next slide, I, along with two of my friends, Marva Swanson and Alethea Chisholm, decided that we needed to expand beyond a regular quilt guild, and we founded the Atlanta Quilt Festival, which is a 501c nonprofit, and the only mission or purpose of the Atlanta Quilt Festival is to have a quilt festival once a year in August. And this year's festival will open on August 6th, and this is our 15th year. And we hope that you will all come to the Southwest Arts Center on New Hope Road and join us. But I want to take a moment to just talk about why I was so inspired to create a whole new organization to exhibit quilts. I've been fortunate enough to basically travel the world, certainly the United States, and once I became a quilter, I would travel to see quilts. And I would go to big shows, little shows, and in my opinion, I never saw enough diversity. And not that you can always tell whether the quilter is black or white, because you can't tell at the Atlanta Quilt Festival, because we have a lot of white quilters whose quilts look blacker than mine. So, but I thought that we needed more diversity and that black quilters needed a place where they could feel welcome. If you read Bridget's book, I only read chapter 5, which was the part about quilts. But if you read her book, I totally agree with her that trying to figure out what the standard is for an excellent piece of art or an excellent quilt can be different for different people. And in the quilt world, if I have traditional quilters in the audience, you know if you're going to win a ribbon at a major quilt show, a majority quilt show, you got to have all your points pointy, you got to have your binding's got to be 45 degrees. I mean, there are things that you are judged on. And what I was seeing in my quilt guild, the Brown Sugar Stitchers, is women making beautiful work that didn't care about pointy points and the binding and whether the stitches were X centimeters and all of that. We cared more about the story. The people I was quilting with, we were telling stories about our life, our children, social justice, It was like night and day. And what would always break my heart, I would say, why don't you enter that beautiful quilt in a quilt show? And they would say, oh, that old thing, that's not good enough. And I set myself on a course to try to correct that. So we started the Atlanta Quilt Festival, in my mind, to try to provide a welcoming environment for African American quilters. Okay, I have 2 minutes to show you a few of my quilts, which they're all online. The reason she said I was national is because I'm the social media queen, and you can find all of these quilts online. But I did want to mention the first one that looks like the library, the books. I made that when I was still practicing law, the Fulton County attorney, and it's actually a memory quilt. And I asked each staff member to give me the name of a book that they would write if they were going to write a book. And then all of the book spines are the books that they would write. So this quilt is quite famous in that it hung in the Fulton County Law Library for many years, and it's also in the book Georgia Quilts, Piecing Together a History. The other, going left to right, the other one is actually one of my favorite, Choose to Bloom. It has exhibited at the International Quilt Festival. I try to give all my quilts interesting names and with a message. The third one is Rain, Resilience, and Rainbows, and it actually accomplished a goal of mine, which was to win a blue ribbon at a white show. And so, I'm very proud of Rain, Resilience, and Rainbows. It's hand applique, and you can't see my stitches if you put a magnifying glass. So that was just a personal goal of mine. And I do want to, and then going to the bottom row, the red and white quilts. I'm quite famous for my red and white quilts because I am a member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority. And I see here my sorors in the audience, and I recently did a one-woman show of all of my red and white quilts that I've made over 20 years. It was spectacular. And that show is headed to Houston in November to the International Quilt Festival. I'm proud of that. And then in the middle is my version of an Underground Railroad quilt. I know that Underground Railroad blocks are controversial. Some people say, oh, that never happened. And when people tell me that, I say, and I still believe in Santa Claus. So if I want to believe that Underground Railroad blocks helped people to escape slavery, then I will. And I love that part of your book about the Underground Railroad. And finally, it's the Oprah quilt, which sort of puts me on the map. It was very exciting for my daughter and I to be in the ballroom when Oprah got her quilt. And I ran up to her as she was leaving because she had to get back on her private plane and go back to California. And I said, do you love the quilt? And she said, yes, I love it. So that is my 8 minutes, and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Ovi. And now we'll hear from our final panelist, Marcia McDowell. You've been working for many years on the largest and now most inclusive and accessible quilt archive in existence. And that's kind of, I think, what you're going to talk about with your slides tonight. But before the panel, we were talking a little bit as well about how Michigan State has really been beating the drum for quilts for decades, right? The high, we're here now. We're super excited to be here. But there are certain museums that have kind of been there all along, although I know that the kind of specific contours of that journey have taken shape differently over the years. So if you want to speak a little bit about the collection at Michigan State and also the archive, we'd love to hear about it.
I will. And I'm also, just after hearing both of you, I thought, I need to say one more thing. So, indulge me. Because I'm an art historian and a folklorist. I love the beauty, all of the aesthetics of all of the elements of a quilt, but I really like the story. And it's almost always the combination of those two that draw me to a quilt. But let me just say a word about how I got into working on research on quilts as one of my main focuses for many decades now. I was in graduate school and I was taking the obligatory art history class in American art, and the man who I was taking the class from said, well, all you students, I would like you to come into my, make an appointment with me so we can discuss your major research topic for the semester. And I went, well, I know what I'm going to talk about. It's going to be about my own family's quilts, because I was blessed with two great-grandmothers who quilted, who did extraordinary quilts, and I grew up sleeping under them. And I took one with me to college, and anyway, I marched into his office with this grand idea that I would, for the first time, really study my grandmother's work, and that I would explore, I would learn more about, where they had learned and what they did in terms of making their decisions about quilts, and why did they think what they did was good, or why did other people think what they did was good. He said to me, that is one of the I don't know how to, I don't remember the exact words because I had fumes coming out of my ears. It's cockamamie ideas I've ever heard. It's not serious art history. Go find something else to do. I quit the class, and it set me on a trajectory to go, I'm going to prove this man is wrong, and that quilts are important to study, and there's many different reasons why. Not only for its beauty, for its stories, for what it can tell us about humanity and creativity, and so that's my trajectory story, and I've inserted that into my 8 minutes. Okay, so fast forward, I did get a job at Michigan State University with my husband, who's in the audience here. The two of us were hired as a team in the 1970s as curators of folk art. And amongst the projects that we started was one to document folk arts in Michigan, much like the Georgia project and Alabama. Almost every state did an initial folk art study and survey and exhibition. And at that time, of course, we were looking at quilts, and I was already interested in quilts, so we were looking at quilts. We did an exhibition. We put in a few quilts, but we went, someday we've got to go back and do more in-depth study of Michigan quilts. Well, we actually took about 3 or 4 years, 5 years to do that, and we were among the first states then to initiate a state survey of quilts. And I think we held 32 documentation days, quilt documentation days in communities all around the state. And so we did that for 2 years, and then we were realizing, oh, you know what? It's only white organizations that are volunteering to host a quilt discovery day, and that doesn't tell the story of quilting in Michigan, especially when we have like huge populations of quilters, black populations in Michigan, and historically black communities like at Idlewild and Remus and Mecosta in southern Michigan. We went, now, what are we going to do to figure out how to bring those communities in? Well, we got some National Endowment for the Arts grant, and we started partnering with minority affairs offices at community colleges, the cooperative extension offices, Juneteenth celebration committees throughout Michigan, then the Detroit African American Museum, which was housed at that time in just like an old row house. And we did quilt documentation days in all of those communities. The first one, I invited Dr. Gladys Marie Fry, the late scholar of slave-made quilts, to come out to Michigan. She was also a folklorist and a friend, so the two of us went to Muskegon, Michigan for the very first day, and there were 60 quilts on the walls. And this was 1985, 86, and 2 years later we were getting inquiries from community members. Would you like to have your quilt or our quilt in your museum? Well, yes, we would. So that is actually how it was mostly, our collection was mostly developed, was because we had shown an interest, a serious interest, and worked with community members, and then we were honored to have their quilts. And I have to say, it was a complete variety of quilts. It was quite a few years later that we did do an exhibition based on that study, that survey, and it showed the gamut of styles, from Gee's Bend styles to ones that were totally not like Gee's Bend. But let me go to the next slide. And so fast forward, I've started with a number of colleagues the Quilt Index, which was effort to take all of those state documentation projects and get them preserved digitally and put into an accessible database. It's a huge digital humanities project. And again, because we were mostly looking at state documentation projects that, like Michigan originally, were mostly looking at white quilting, the database reflected white quilting. So about, now, yeah, we'll go back one slide. A couple of years ago, we wrote a grant to the National Endowment for the Humanities to start a Black Diaspora Quilt History Project with a concerted effort to get data into the Quilt Index that better represents the breadth of quilting in this country. And so that's an icon right there that was developed by my project colleague, and then some of the quilts, and you go to the next slide. And now if you go into the Quilt Index, www.quiltindex.org, you can begin to see from across the country quilts that were made by Black quilters, as well as you will be seeing quilts from Liberian quilters, Egyptian quilters, Sidi, the African Indian quilters in India, and South African quilters. So it's a massive, massive project, and I'm really so excited that we are going to be working with the High Museum to get its quilt collection in, and this person next to me doesn't know it yet, but we're going to be really working hard with your group to get them in. We're working with the Women of Color Quilters Network, the Great Lakes African American Quilt Network, and it just goes like on and on. But I'm so pleased we're at this point, because it will be a wonderful resource for teaching and for scholarship, and it will definitely show the breadth. I'm done. Oh, I'm sorry, one more slide. I did forget. Now, just as I'm sorry, one more slide. There's 3 South African quilts on this slide, and then this small quilt that is with a pastel palette. That pastel palette one was made by Rosa Parks, who brought her quilt in to one of the quilt discovery days in in Detroit, and she brought one of her mother's quilts in with her as well, because she was interested in quilting and she wanted to make sure that her story about quilting and the story about her mother as a quilter. So you can see that on the Quilt Index.
So this is the one you're talking about by Rosa Parks?
Yes,
This one here.
thank you.
Wonderful. That's a great segue into a question I have, because from all of you I'm hearing about the kind of pluralism and diversity of styles within Black quilting traditions, right? It's not monolithic. There are certain types of quilts, like improvisational G's Bend type quilts, that have gotten a lot of attention, but that you know, quilting in general, and then certainly Black quilting within it, is not any one thing, right? And I've heard some of you describe differently all the different things it can be. And for me, it's interesting because part of a challenge of bringing these kinds of objects into museums like the High is that we are still often asked to judge everything by the kind of rubric of masterpiece and connoisseurship. And when it's an area like quilts, or really anything in my whole world of folk and self-taught art where most people in the room don't really know about it, that can be a challenge, right? Arguing for this is quality, like this is a really important piece. So I'd love to kind of go down the line, maybe starting with you, Bridget, and talk about those kind of issues of pluralism, right? Of excellence that can look like a lot of different ways, and how that kind of can present problems, right? Whether it's at a quilt festival or at a museum collections committee, or in other contexts for really advancing the visibility of quilts.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fight that's been fought for decades. People have talked about the Black aesthetic, but I think part of the issue, I guess optimistically we can say, is education. If we teach people about different aesthetic traditions, that they'll change. I have, in my age and time in the field, don't think that's true for all circumstances. So some people are very tied to maintaining traditions in the way that keeps them on top. And they see it as a personal and national affront to expand ideas of beauty. So that's part of what we're up against. The Q word, right? Quality, that means something different to each person. And the Q word has been very narrow for the history of American museums. And that's why we have Black museums, right? That's why in the 60s we started, not the very first Black museum, but in a sort of broad scale. I mean, there were many more museums focused on Black creativity in the 60s and 70s than there are now. And now, MoMA is working with the Studio Museum of Harlem. They're trying to get the studio shows at MoMA. They're doing a Ming Smith show right now. So there are just philosophical ways that people just decide this is my line and you can't cross it. And we don't get to benefit as museum goers to really see a full range of ideas and creativity and beauty because of it.
Well, I would start with the Q word, as you said, quality, which goes to the mission of the Atlanta Quilt Festival. Our focus is on getting African American quilters to bring their quilts out of their house and put them on the wall and let other people see them. And so we take beginners all the way up to professionals. Our youngest quilter for the last 2 years was 8 years old. And she had, a little 12-inch block her grandmother had helped her with. And so the point is to exhibit. We try not to judge too much. But we do recognize that there are different categories. Well, we decided that we would have different categories. We have traditional quilts, art quilts, and modern quilts. And then later, we came up with a category called African American Heritage because so many of our quilters are about telling the story and not necessarily about, just being a quilt. And so that has worked for us. So I really want you to come to the Atlanta Quilt Festival. You can see the gamut of all types of quilts, and you can also see, okay, here's a little brag. One of the other things that we do at the Atlanta Quilt Festival is we have a master quilter who comes to teach other quilters. Well, in 2014, Bisa Butler was our master quilter. And she came, and 40 women, we all took her class and tried to learn her technique, but nobody can do it like she does. And so I would venture to say when she started quilting, she would have never gotten into a regular quilt show. So we try not to turn anybody down, and then our audience can figure out what they like. We do a best of show voting over a month. Our audience votes, and my slides did include the last 3 best of show. The first one is that embroidery quilt. It won best of show for embroidery, and then Carolyn's Michelle Obama quilt. And the one in the middle was last year's best of show by Jan Hollins, named A Mother's Love. And they're all different, but we just let our people decide what they like.
You got the ribbons on them in the picture, right? Yeah.
One of the things that I like about, if you could go back to the Rosa Parks quilt, is that's always a great foil to talk about what is an African American quilt. What museum would want that quilt? And, she was a seamstress. Of course, it was, all corners were mitered and all stitches were like exact, because that was her occupation. And so that, again, this is the story part of it for me, is that it tells you something about the person as a human being. And even those two quilts, I mean, those are 3 South African quilts, but that one quilt that's red and navy blue, the quilt maker who made that, Maria Serra, who is in Soweto, part of the Zamani Quilting Sisters, she used a pattern that was available in a U.S. publication. You know, so it's playing with all of these, you know, cultural exchanges, these, the trade in fabrics, Dr. Carolyn Mazlumi and I worked on a quilt exhibit made a call for quilts from Women of Color Quilters Network and from South African quilters, mostly, but not all white, women of color quilters, as the name goes, mostly all quilters of color. Each person was going to do a quilt in tribute to Nelson Mandela. Well, the Women of Color Quilters Network infused all kinds of African fabric into their quilts, as did the white South African quilters. So, you know, putting the quilts next to each other, they were all tributes to Nelson Mandela. Every one was a lovely tribute to the person. And we put the quilts in alpha order by the name of the quilt maker. It was really hard to tell who made it.
And there's, you mentioned Dr. Carolyn Mazlumi, who couldn't be here for this event, but she actually has an exhibition up at the Booth Museum in Cartersville. So she curated an exhibition of quilts about Black pioneers. And so for people who are Atlanta-based in this audience tonight, that's about an hour, an hour, 15 minutes north of here. And it's up for another few weeks, so definitely try to check that out if you can. I'm going to just ask one more question, which is related to Bridget, kind of how you started off some of your remarks around giving us all in the audience a little bit of quilt history, quilt reception history, the ways that, there have been these moments of where the gate kind of opens a little bit for quilts and Black quilts specifically in mainstream institutional contexts, and then it either closes or it just doesn't ever get more open, right? And I just wanted to hear from each of you, like I know, Ovi, we were talking earlier about how it's your season right now, like things are happening, and I'm just curious from each of you a little bit about, are we in a different moment now? Like, is there a future that you see based on things that you're working on, that you're a part of, that you're experiencing, where it feels like we might actually be able to receive, right? Receive Black quilts in a way that they haven't been in the past? Or will this be another kind of just opening a little bit and maybe not all the way?
Well, I think it ebbs and flows. It does mean something for you to do this work. I think it would be really difficult in an earlier generation to find a white woman in a Black city at a mainstream museum who's saying we need to focus on Black quilts as abstraction. That's kind of science fiction. Right? And you worked with Rick Powell at Duke. I think this is a different moment. I think we go through cycles. I don't think that history repeats itself. I think we see familiar things and activities, but it's a different moment, and so it's not identical. So I do think that progress can be made. I also think the enemies of progress double down, and we still have to do what we do. So it's a different moment, and good things do happen. We forget about that because we're overshadowed by all the bad things. But good things do happen. This is a big deal for everyone to say, oh, quilts, I'm going to the High tonight, you know. And, you know, people want to meet Marcia and OV, and, you know, they're here on pilgrimages. And, I mean, all of that is real. We have to remember that that has meaning. So I do think that we are in a moment, but things cycle, so we may have to wait again for another moment.
Well, I guess I will say almost the same thing in a different way. I do think that we are in a moment for two reasons. Number one, we as citizens of the United States view diversity differently. I have a long view of diversity because I grew up in the segregated South. I was born in 1954, and I didn't go to school with white kids until I was in the 7th grade. So when I look at this, I see progress, progress, progress. But I say it's because of people like a Katie and other like-minded people who have decided to look at things through a different lens. So yes, I think we are in a different moment. But as it relates to quilts in particular, I think we're in a double different moment in that I think the Black Lives Matter movement had a huge impact on quilting. I mean, people started, it seems like there was an explosion of social justice quilts. Every quilt show I went to, there was a social justice exhibit, and that came to be accepted, that you could do exhibits about I can't breathe and all the other things, and that's new. That's new. So that, to me, that's like a double different moment, that Black stories are now accepted in majority quilt shows and galleries.
And I'll just say that I'm talking with two colleagues about developing an exhibition on Afrofuturism and quilts to maybe like push it even forward. And who knows what that will result in. But I think it's always pushing, both the boundaries of diversity within collections, but also the boundary of what that diversity means within the collections. So just from that sampling on the screen right there, it's not just one story, it's just not one type. I remember so well the late Questa Benberry, the pioneer African-American quilt scholar, who came into that Michigan African-American quilt exhibition, and she stopped in the beginning of the gallery. She could scan the quilts that were there, and she said, "You got it right. It's all of what we're doing. All of it needs to be looked at."
Well, thank you all for being here, for sharing your incredible perspectives, and yeah, it's just been a pleasure. I think we were going to open it up for some brief audience question times. If anybody has, yeah, definitely. And I should also say that if any of you have, if you have any questions for each other,
Does anybody have any questions? Oh, sorry.
In your museum, I got two quick questions. What's the oldest quilt in your collection, and how do you know? How do you date a quilt when you get one in to study?
All right. Remember when I said I'm an art historian and a folklorist? I go to the textile specialist to date the quilts. But our oldest quilts date from like 1820, I think, the Euro-American ones. And that's a good question for me to go back and think about in terms of the African-American quilt ones. I don't know. And I think because I've also done a lot of research on Native American quilts, and this goes to the, like, is a quilt valuable to keep, or do you just use it up in the context of everyday living? That's how I know most Native American quilts, it's hard to find an extant one that dates to, even the 1900s. So, yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, hold on one second.
So throughout the conversation, I heard a lot of discussion about the stories that the quilts tell. Is there any work that's done to merge the story with the quilt, like keep them attached, or are they like more like two separate paths?
Yeah, I was going to ask you.
I was just going to say, with the Quilt Index, there is a form that you can fill out. Actually, anybody here who makes a quilt, you can now sit at your own computer, go into the Quilt Index. There's a little tab at the top that says Add Quilts, and there's a form and lots of guidelines, and you can write in your own story, write in your own description of your quilt, put in a picture of you and of your quilt. So it already embeds the storytelling in the documentation that we are seeking. But for this, I think we did 26 interviews, oral history interviews with that African American Quilt Project, which were done on cassette tape. And as part of this grant, they're all being digitized and transcribed, and they will all be accessible on the Quilt Index, including the one that we did with Mrs. Parks.
We have time for one more question.
I just wanted to respond to that too a little bit, just to say that, we quite a few quilts, period, in the Highs collection are, we don't know who made them. They weren't signed. They got, collected by somebody at some point who lost connection with who they might have gotten them from. And this is a problem that part of what we want to do with especially some of the Black quilts in our collection that are unidentified, but we believe that they were made by Black quilters because of the kind of the style and where they came from. But something that I think is amazing about what I understand, lots of quilt guilds do and quilt festivals, is that they help quilters understand the value, as Obi has been saying, of what you're making, right? And that you do need to put a signature on it, and that you do need to attach the story to your quilt because it might get separated from the object at some point. And I wanted to call out the Michelle Obama quilt that Carolyn White made, who's in the audience, has an incredible... Yes. I mean, she didn't just sign it on the back of the quilt, and this is true of a lot of her quilts. There's a whole storyboard of the story. There are photo printed fabric panels that she created that actually document all of the different ways that all the work this quilt is doing. It's paying tribute to G's Ben quilters, so she has images of G's Ben quilts on the back of it. It's thinking about other kind of milestones and moments of extreme love in Black cultural history, as between Nat King Cole and Natalie with Unforgettable. It actually plays Unforgettable from a tiny speaker in the back of it, and the lyrics are printed on a photo panel on the back of the quilt. And when Carolyn and I were walking through the galleries at some point over the past year, she pointed out that was, that's part of why she does that, right? Is keep the story, to make the artist statement essentially a part of the quilt. And I wish more artists did that on all of their objects, really find a way to actually attach it to the thing so that it can never be separated, because otherwise it can be hard to find again.
You want to take one more question? I think. Okay.
First of all, thank you all for your insight, your expertise just in the 8 minutes you had. got me thinking all kinds of ways, and thank you, Katie, for putting this together. I want to kind of extend this conversation, or kind of our view, to actual value. We're not talking about the dollars and cents that are attached and how often the quilts are devalued, and getting them into these institutions helps to elevate the value. And that's an issue with Black art in general, and how that gatekeeping, like how do we increase the number of appraisers, the process of getting appraisal. That's where the gatekeeping starts, with attaching a value. So have we thought about that? Or I'd like to kind of consider, ask you all, have you considered that, how you value your work, how you consider a piece when you buy it for a museum? How does that take place?
Well, we should probably ask Katie to do a whole seminar on that. It's so hard. It's so hard because I get that question from new quilters all the time. Somebody wants to buy my quilt, how much should I charge? And it's just such a hard question. You know, how sentimental are you about the quilt? I mean, how special is it? How long did it take you to do it? Can you bear to part with it? I mean, I have some quilts I would never sell, but it's very, very hard, but it helps tremendously when the High Museum buys a quilt that was at the Atlanta Quilt Festival. Then I can say to other quilters, well, I don't know how much they're paying, but if I were you, you know, I would be trying to be in the museum category or whatever. But it's difficult, very, very difficult.
And I would just add that this goes back to the queue problem that we were talking about earlier, because when we present a piece for acquisition, as Uvi was saying, I mean, it's like when there's no previous sale, when that artist doesn't have an extensive exhibition history, I mean, good luck. It's not easy. And even when they do, because people, you know, devalue certain kinds of objects, certain kinds of makers, and it's difficult. So, there's, so I don't really have a great answer for what the scientific process by which we value things in a museum context is, because it's not scientific. That's the reality of the whole art market, is that it's all based on desire, what the price that somebody's willing to pay, really, for an object. And so it's, Bridget, do you want to add anything? It sounds like you're ruminating over there.
I don't have anything helpful to say about quilts, but I'll tell you, Ernie Barnes, you know, Katie mentioned that I curated a show. So 4 years ago, I had the Sugar Shack in my show, which people will know from the cover of Marvin Gaye's album, I Want You, and people who are old enough to remember Good Times, the TV show. Well, last year it sold for $15 million. It did not appraise for that 3 years earlier when it was in my exhibition. So it really is about desire. Are people willing to pay? Now, on a practical level, you could look, what are the G's Ben quilters selling their quilts for? And some, in the past, they have sold them on Etsy. I don't know if they still do. Mm-hmm. So there's, some ways just to get some parameters so it's not totally abstract.
That's really practical advice, actually, and that is how we do it. I mean, comparables. So any quilter who is trying to price their work, reaching out to someone like OV, reaching out to somebody who works in a quilt guild, auctions. All of those are good breadcrumbs to follow of how you might, price.
And 2 quick points. I would just say that the whole appraisal world is a whole other discussion. That's panel number 3, maybe. Just finding somebody who I would consider qualified to appraise Black quilts is very difficult. I mean, I've had a lot of my quilts appraised, but, the value word or devaluing word comes in. But one thing that we do at the Atlanta Quilt Festival, we print a little program booklet. And if the quilter wants to sell her quilt, we ask her to put the price in the booklet so that people can begin to see there are no $100 quilts here, So we try to do our part to lift up the price.
I'll just say that we have 3 Bisa Butler quilts in our collection. None of them were collected when she became famous. And they came in as part of, one of them came in as part of the Women of Color Quilters Network collection. One of them came as a result. She made one for the Mandela quilt exhibit, and she made one for the Desmond Tutu quilt exhibit that we did. But today, we could not afford a Bisa Butler. So we're, grateful we have these 3 in her development years.
All right, well, thank you all for being here with us tonight. We hope you'll come back. I didn't fully articulate that this part of why we're doing this work right now is because we are having an exhibition next summer, next June. And it's called Patterns and Abstraction, which is why you kept hearing that theme come up. And it will be a modest show of some of the black quilts from our collection, but we will do more activities around all of the things that we were speaking about tonight. And so please stay attuned to events for that exhibition next year. We hope to see you back at the High, and hopefully before then, too.